the question is about the Kherson withdrawal of the Russians. It has now been announced by the Russian government that they are withdrawing from the Kherson region uh, in Ukraine. Right, the Russian armed forces are withdrawing from Kherson. So, what does it mean? How are we to interpret this? Does it mean that the Russians are facing a defeat? Is this indicative of a Russian defeat in the Kherson region? And does it indicate that this is a significant sign of Russian weakness? Right? Are we witnessing a significant Russian weakness that is being exposed now by the NATO coalition of forces in Ukraine? Does it mean that the tide has turned in favor of NATO? Right? That's another question. And then we have to look at it from India's perspective. How should India interpret what we are witnessing right now? How should China interpret what this Russian withdrawal from Kherson? Right? And how should the BRICS nations interpret this, and does this represent a loss of reputation and a loss of prestige for Vladimir Putin? So these are the questions. So let's take a look at the map. We are seeing a map of the Ukraine region, the Black Sea region, and let's see where Kherson is. So this here is the city of Kherson, and Kherson is essentially a province. It is named after the city. So the Kherson province is where the Russians are withdrawing from, not from the entire province, but from the right bank or the western bank of the river Dnieper. Right. So that's what we are witnessing. Now we also know that 2 months ago the Russians also withdrew from the Kharkiv region in northeastern Ukraine, in essentially in eastern Ukraine. That was approximately around the time of around 10th of September 2022. Right? And the conflict started on February 24, 2022, with this, which Vladimir Putin called his special operation in Ukraine. At the end of September, we had the annexation of 4 provinces or regions of Ukraine: Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. So, which made these regions part of Russia. The Russians call it the reunification of these regions from with Russia. And I had said at the time that these regions now fall under the Russian nuclear umbrella. So if anybody tries to take these regions, the Russians may possibly resort to, if required, potentially the use of nuclear weapons, possibly, potentially, right? So these regions, once that they are part officially of Russia, they fall under the Russian nuclear umbrella. And now we are witnessing the withdrawal of the Russian forces from the right bank or the western bank of the Dnieper River in the Kherson province. So that's and this was announced in a televised address by the commander of the Russian armed forces, General Sergei Surovikin, I think his name is, right. And it was also announced by the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu in a televised address. So it's clear that the Russians are withdrawing, and the withdrawal is ongoing right now. So let's take a look at let's take a look at what the Americans are saying about this. So let me put that on the screen. A tweet by the Study of War, the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, which is an American organization. So they have put up these maps of what's happening in the Kherson region. Once the map loads, we shall take a look at it. It looks like it's taking a while. Here it is. So this is the situation, and they have put up some more images, right? So this tweet was on November 12, which is essentially yesterday. So they are saying that Ukrainian forces are completing the liberation of the western bank of the Kherson Oblast after the Russians retreated from it, right? And let's take a look at a better map so that we understand in detail what's happening. Let's do that. So I have this image here that I shall put on the screen. Here we are. Okay, I think this will give you a good example, a good idea of what's happening. So the dark red region with the stripes is the Crimean Peninsula, which is occupied by Russia since 2014. The red regions are occupied by Russia, basically annexed by the Russians. The blue region is where you have Ukrainian reported counteroffensive, and we have the Kherson city, the city of Kherson here, and we are witnessing over here, the striped region is where the Russians are withdrawing from. So that is the situation right now. So what are we to understand this? Understand from what's happening. So first of all, let's understand what this war is all about. Right? Russia and Ukraine are fighting two very different conflicts. Russia, as we know, has refrained from waging what the Americans call total war on Ukraine. The Americans have this. I mean, it's a concept that I think the Chinese first came up with, but it's called total war, which means you use every resource at your disposal, the army, the navy, the air force, every single thing at your disposal to completely annihilate the nation. Shock and awe. That's an American term. And that's what they did in that's what the Americans did in Iraq, for instance, right? When they essentially flattened Iraq and Baghdad in the first 24 to 48 hours of the second Iraq conflict, right? Just carpet bombing everything, flattening everything. The Russians have refrained from waging this sort of war against Ukraine. And Russia, as we know, has refused to commit even 5% of its air force in the Ukraine conflict. The Russians are essentially fighting, in a sense, with one hand tied behind their back. They have voluntarily decided to do this, right? So, on the one hand, the Russians are refraining from doing all this. They are refusing to use the air force at all. They're using a couple of a few fighter aircraft here and there, and a few helicopters, right? And that's what we are seeing. And they're not using the bulk of their air force, which is very, very powerful. And on the other hand, we have NATO. So the Ukrainian armed forces are essentially NATO armed forces. It's a whole coalition of nations. And what we are seeing is that NATO is continuously replenishing and resupplying and bolstering Ukraine's military capabilities. We are witnessing the classic proxy warfare. It's a proxy war. We witnessed a proxy war in the Kashmir region of India, right, where the Pakistanis, aided, financed by the US, waged for a proxy war in the region, even in the Punjab region, for a very long time. Even now, there is a low intensity, kind of proxy warfare going on there. Whatever terrorist activities happen in Kashmir from time to time sporadically are part of that proxy war. But in Ukraine, we are witnessing a full-scale proxy war. The Ukrainian armed forces they exist and they are being replenished by NATO constantly, continuously, and a whole lot of arms and ammunition, etc., is flowing into Ukraine. So that's why the Ukrainian armed forces are there, right? So Ukraine is fighting total war, all out war with essentially unlimited resources. It is throwing essentially unlimited men into the war, into the meat grinder of war. And that's what we witnessed in the Kharkiv region, and that's what we are witnessing in other places as well. On the other hand, the Russians are constrained, they are restricted. It's a military operation that is designed to minimize collateral damage, minimize damage to infrastructure and civilians. Of course, some of that will happen. It's a war. You can't ensure that no civilian ever dies, but that's how it is. That's the nature of war. The other thing we are witnessing, the other difference is that the Ukrainians are fighting on their own territory. The Russians are essentially fighting on NATO territory, NATO occupied territory, or enemy territory, right? So that's where we are. So that's what's happening. So what are the scenarios that we can see? What are the possible scenarios? We are witnessing an undoubted Russian withdrawal from a region it recently declared to have been what's it called, reunified with Russia. So just recently they declared it's reunified after the referendum, and now they are withdrawing from essentially a third or a quarter of the Kherson Oblast. So one scenario, the more likely scenario, is that NATO is winning and Russia is losing this particular segment of the conflict, right? And if this is correct, then we will witness, if this scenario is correct, that Russia is losing and NATO is winning, then we will see in the next few days Ukraine attempting to cross the river Dnieper and try to move on Crimea. So as you can see in the map, the Dnieper river is the fourth largest, I think the fourth largest river in Europe, right? So the city of Kherson lies on the west bank of this river. That's where the Russians are withdrawing from. They are crossing the river and going eastwards. So if it is indeed a case of Russia losing because they are incapable of fighting and NATO winning, then in the next few days we will witness, but possibly, the Ukrainians tried to cross the river and get into the southern part of the Kherson Oblast, and maybe even try to make a military march or a move on Crimea itself. So if so, that is the first possibility, the first scenario. The second scenario is that there is maybe there are attempts to diplomatic attempts to agree upon a ceasefire. Most diplomacy happens in secrecy. Diplomacy always happens behind the scenes. It's only when something is agreed upon that it is made public. So maybe there is backdoor diplomacy happening. Maybe a third party, a third nation may be involved in negotiating and brokering a ceasefire for the conflict. And maybe one of the conditions or preconditions or prerequisites of this future ceasefire is that Russia should withdraw from this portion of the Kherson Oblast. Possibly. So that is the second possibility, that there are secret negotiations happening, and maybe this is one of the requirements for a ceasefire. So if this scenario is correct, you may see this fructifying during the G20 summit, which is going to happen next week, 15, 16 November, right? When Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, somewhere there. And so if this is the case, then this ceasefire could fructify during or soon after the G20 summit, which is coming up next week. So possibility one, scenario one, is that NATO is winning, Russia is losing, in which case you will see the Ukrainian armed forces try to cross over the river and try to make a move on Crimea, and they will definitely bombard Crimea with their artillery, because now Crimea is in range of their long range artillery. The second scenario is that there is a potential ceasefire coming up, and this is a prerequisite of the ceasefire. The third possibility is that this is a nasty trap for NATO. The Russians are laying a trap. In military, in one of the classic military strategies is the false withdrawal. It's a tactic that makes the opposition armed forces get into a territory where then you can turn the tide and try to annihilate them. So this is a rather unlikely scenario. The potential or probability of this is low, but yes, one has to consider this as well, that this is a nasty trap that the Russians have planted for NATO. I would say that the most likely two scenarios is that either the Russians are losing this part of the conflict, or there are secret negotiations for a ceasefire, in which case this could be one of the potential prerequisites for the ceasefire, that Russia should withdraw from this part of the Ukrainian territory, right? So what does this all mean? Is this a Russian defeat? We still don't know. The next forthcoming days will tell us what really happened. It's a Russian defeat, or it's a tactical withdrawal, a trap, or a ceasefire is coming up. We still don't know. Is it a sign of Russian weakness? Possibly a sign of Russian weakness. It doesn't mean that the war is over and the Russians have lost. A war can go on for months, years. I'm not sure we are anywhere close to the conflict, the end of the conflict. Obviously, we know that like everyone is saying these days, winter is coming, and the Russians will utilize the cold of the winter to pressurize Europe and the people of Europe to get certain concessions and end the war in favor of Russia in some way or the other. So it could possibly be a sign of Russian weakness. Has the tide turned in favor of NATO? Or we still have to see about that. The next few days, the next coming days, and maybe a couple of weeks will tell us clearly where we are. How should India and China interpret this? India and China will be obviously in touch with all the sides. Dr. Jaishankar and Mr. Wang Yi of China, these are the two respective foreign ministers. They will be in touch with their Russian counterpart, and I'm sure at a higher level also there could be communications. So India and China will be watching this very carefully, very closely. Yes, it is obviously best for the non-superpower great powers of the world that this conflict does not go too long. It does not, become a catastrophe, or there should be no crossing of the nuclear threshold or any of that. And obviously, we would like to see a ceasefire, maybe around this time. Yeah. And along the lines that of control that we have. So it's something that India and China will both be observing very closely. Is this a loss of reputation for Vladimir Putin? The Western media is trying to make it look like that. Yeah, there are even some reports in the Western media that Alexander Dugin, who is one of the famous philosophers and geostrategists, nationalists. They call him an ultra right wing nationalist geopolitical strategist, right? So there are reports in the Western media that Alexander Dugin, who recently lost his daughter in a terrorist attack, there are reports that he has called for the removal and possibly even killing of Vladimir Putin. So that's what the Western media is reporting. Now we have to take these reports with a grain of salt, because all media is these days propaganda. Please understand that. So my perspective is very clear. We have to wait and watch. There could be 3 or 4 different scenarios being played out. Each of these scenarios has a certain possibility. The most probable scenario is that Russia is currently at this time showing weakness in this region, and they are being forced to withdraw. That is one possibility. The other possibility, which also is significantly possible, is that there could be a ceasefire coming up. Yeah, and the least likely possibility is that the Russians have laid a trap for the Ukrainians. So let's keep an eye on this. We're gonna keep on watching this. So these are the possible scenarios that we are witnessing. Winter is coming. This could get very long and very. Uh, Winter is typically brutal in these regions. Yeah, so yeah, there are all kinds of possible scenarios open. I don't think Russia is on the brink of defeat or anything. The first thing we have to understand is Russia is fighting on enemy territory. No actual Russian territory apart from the annexed regions is facing any they're not facing any loss of territory. So that's where we are. And the important thing from Russia's perspective, if you look at it, is that their entire air force is sitting not idle, it is sitting in reserve. And why is Mr. Putin not using his air force? Because he's saving it for a future actual conflict with NATO. That's what we are seeing. So so that's the scenario, right? We still don't know where we are. We still don't know what's happening, but these are the potential scenarios. Let's wait for a week. Let's wait for the G20 summit to happen. Let's wait for a week after that, and then we will have much more clarity. So in the next episode of the Indian Interest, I will not again, but I will revisit this question of what happened and what's happening in the Kherson region. But that is where we are for now, and that is the analysis that I can offer to you.